tonight, and for those that are able to connect over the internet. I am deeply grateful for everyone that took the time, made the journey from near and far to be here this evening, to be a part of the conversation that we're going to have tonight and over the next few days. There's so many things that inundate us as human beings, and so many things that can seem too big or too loud for us to be able to handle, which is part of what we're going to be talking about this evening. But we know that you are greater than all of that. So as we talk through trauma tonight, its effects and what we do about it, help us remember that we need to be ministered to as we prepare to minister to others. So let your truth be the strongest, loudest thing for us this evening. Let it be comforting and instructive. And may your glory be reflected in all that we say and do. And we ask this all in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. So I am really grateful for you all being here. I know it was kind of a unusual thing. We had a conference we were all going to be a part of that got postponed, so we said, hey, let's do our own. So this is going to be it. Whether we'll do this in the future, we don't know, and it doesn't matter because the future may not get here, right? So one of the, obviously, Truth and Love Biblical Counseling and Training Center, we got some changes going on. Website addresses, Truth and Love Biblical Training Center.com. That will take you to the old VancouverBible.com website. That site address still works, but we're trying to put everything under one name. And because we've relocated to Southern California, there's no Vancouver in California. So calling it Vancouver Bible Institute seemed, a little narrow for some people. Plus, we get a lot of people from British Columbia who find us and sign up for classes and then realize they're looking at the wrong Vancouver. We have 1 Thess 5:14, which is 1 Thessalonians 5:14, which is our biblical counseling mission statement, if you will. And then what you can't see there is authenticbiblicalcounseling.com. That will take you to the old tilbcc.com website, a counseling website. If you put in the tilbcc.com website that you used to have, it will take you to a landing page from which you can click on training, which will take you to the old VBI website, or counseling, which will take you to the counseling website. There's just so much on those two websites to try to put on one. Right now is just too much. So we decided, under great help from Chelsea, we decided to do this, and we'll see how that goes. Okay, for some reason we're not advancing. Hang on. Oh, I see. See if that works. Ha ha ha. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a broken spirit dries up the bones. Proverbs 17:22. One of the most intense and debilitating whole person dilemmas a person can experience is what the world calls PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or its very complicated cousin, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or CPTSD. And we're going to define those terms shortly. But we have to understand that the world calls this a disorder because the world believes that we're not supposed to be traumatized by things that are gross violations of God's created order and design. The world believes that we're not supposed to be racked by being exposed to things, seeing things, and experiencing things that are gross violations, like death, like abuse, like oppression, like all of those things. And there's an organization that I'm a part of called Fallen Soldiers March, Biblical Counseling Network. Fallen Soldiers March works with veterans and their families with helping minister to all the consequences of war. So war is not part of God's design, okay? And so there are things that happen in war to first responders, to abuse survivors, that God never intended for us to have to experience. And the fact that we do experience them will rock our world, and it will change us as it's supposed to. So what the world calls post-traumatic stress disorder, We just call it post-traumatic stress. It's stress that continues after the trauma event. Okay? It's not a disorder, it's a malfunction. It's a malfunction of a system that God built into us. Okay? If I say you have a disorder, what does that tell you about yourself? It means you're kind of stuck, right? But if I say something is malfunctioning, that provides a little bit of hope and it can be repaired, yes? And we're actually going to talk a little bit tonight about how that happens, right? So, but we're going to use PTSD for a while. It really is a Humpty Dumpty-esque story where great trauma has invaded a person's life, shattering their world, their assumptions, their sense of safety, even their sense of good and their ability to find balance and to make sense of the world. It is a silent scream no one seems to hear. The trauma of our past won't leave us alone no matter how we run from it, medicate it, try to deny it, try to distract it with busyness or other things that drain our energy and divert our thoughts. We're trying to get away from something that happened in our past. Our hearts and our faith can feel incredibly weak at times, like they could give out at any moment. Hopelessness, helplessness can be so overwhelming that if there was a way to quit without quitting life, we'd take it. Sadly, however, many PTSD and CPTSD sufferers do quit. We lose an American service member to completed suicide every 26 minutes. We can't escape the monster in the closet. And even when life seems normal and none of the overwhelming mental, emotional, or physical symptoms are active for the moment, we're all too aware that that monster can be startled awake in a flash. It never goes completely away, but it can be reconditioned to go into such a deep state of hibernation that it's more like a sock sticking out of a drawer, an annoyance, than a constant threat. PTSD and CPTSD are so little understood by society in general, and often even less by those who suffer from them. What's even saddest is that with the estimated 8 million men, women, and children personally impacted by the debilitating impacts of post-trauma stress, as well as the multiple millions of friends and family members close to them, the world, including the church, understands almost nothing about this epidemic. Those charged with soul care, pastors, counselors, often have even less of an understanding. What's encouraging is for those of us here today to be able to be a part of the movement to bring those deeply wounded and broken bearers of the Imago Dei the help that only God, His Word, and His people can bring. We have a reason to be unashamed to call ourselves disciples of Jesus Christ. You being here is a big step in resolving the disparity between what we say we are about and what we bring to the table as a body of Christ. I congratulate you and I commend you. So, what is it? What is PTSD? What is complex PTSD? Well, let's define some terms. First, we have PTD or ASD, post-traumatic distress. It's an acute stress disorder also. This is the ongoing or recurring, interrelated, interwoven emotional and mental reactions to the stress of a traumatic event in a person's life, a past life. It could be past as yesterday, it could be past as a month ago. This will often cause corresponding physical stress responses to develop as a result. Now, they say the duration of this is less than 3 months after the event. Okay? This is how our council and ministry has chosen to define all categories of what the world has labeled PTSD and CPTSD, post-trauma distress or post-trauma stress, PTD or PTS. A lot of people in the biblical counseling world are starting to call it PTS. I called it PTD for a long time. So then you have post-traumatic stress disorder. It's what they call trauma 1. This is a label used to quantify a spectrum of after reactions to trauma, usually denoting a long-term, intense, and triggered set of reactions to that past event or situation. It picks up at the 3-month mark of PTD if symptoms continue or begin at the 3-month mark. So usually after something happens and a person's ability to cope and manage starts to balance those things out and they find a new point of equilibrium, they say, okay, well, we're not gone into PTSD. But if it continues on beyond that, then they start to call it as PTSD. And trauma 1, this is a direct related thing. Okay? But then they have CPTSD, or complex PTSD, trauma 2. This develops as a result of either 1, long-term, sustained, or repeated traumas, or 2, multiple trauma events that combine and compound, often with a complexity of differing yet powerful triggers. So what we're talking about is you have long-term, sustained, or repeated trauma. So you have somebody that experiences long-term childhood abuse, okay? Or the second, multiple trauma events. You have someone who experienced abuse, abandonment, neglect, but they also experienced their house burning down and losing everything, including a pet. And then they also lost mom and grandma and grandpa within a year. Multiple trauma events. They just couldn't get their feet under them to adjust. Then you add to that someone who ends up with consequences of war, and they got a lot going on. And never being able to resolve those things, they can never get their feet under them, never get a balance point. Always in reaction mode to something that's not current and present, but something that's past. Still trying to resolve, still trying to rectify that in their mind, if you will. Okay, so it is important for us to keep in mind that we as human beings are synergistic wholes. Synergistic whole. We are body, we are mind, we are soul. We don't have those things, we are those things. So consequently, what impacts one aspect of us impacts all the other aspects of us. You can't have something impact the brain and not impact the body and not impact the soul. The psalmist reminds us through the Psalms when he says, I am exhausted as I groan. All night long I drench my bed in tears. My tears saturate the cushion beneath me. And he says, and I am poured out like water. And he says, my strength fails me because of my sin, and my bones become brittle. He says, I am depressed. He says, I cannot eat. I weep day and night. And several similar symptoms. You talk to there are some people that had something that happened long ago, and they're still troubled by it. So what distinguishes PTSD and CPTSD, again, we're using the world's words, from other what we call biodynamic problems, where the whole organism is impacted, that people in our world face each day? Well, let's take a look at some of these. The first is re-experiencing. I need to get rid of that thing. Hang on a second. Let me see if I can get this down here, because where is it? There we go. That's better, huh? Okay. So it's re-experiencing the mental, emotional, and physical dynamics of the traumatic event or events as if they are happening in that moment through vivid, intrusive memories, flashbacks, and nightmares or night terrors. Okay, and it's not really being re-experienced, but all the sensations are being re-experienced as if it was right now, instead of a year ago, or 5 years ago, or 30 years ago. This brings psychological and emotional arousal that intensifies the fear, caution, guardedness of the events. That kicks into survival mode as if you're in the middle of the event, even though you're not. Okay? So that creates what we call avoidance. So this is where a person will push away the memories. And they'll do all they can to avoid situations that remind them of the emotions they experienced during that event. This often includes numbing, which is a process by which a person chooses not to feel anything at all, because feeling nothing is preferable to having to deal with all the emotional pain and turmoil of the trauma event. We have to remember that emotions are like a microwave. They're on or they're off, okay? It's not like a stove where you got different burners and an oven and you can have different combinations. Emotions are ganged together. When you say, I don't want to feel this, you're saying, I don't want to feel. And that's where an emotional numbing comes in. Now, this is an understandable reaction, but it actually prevents the memories of the event from being properly understood and categorized in order for them to be resolved. They don't become history. They're still current. They're still present. And until we're able to resolve that, a person is stuck in the past. When we look at things, okay, God told them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, bring order out of chaos. And the instant you looked at this, your mind started to try to sort and categorize that. You're trying to look for patterns. You're trying to sort through and make some sense of that. If it was in color, it would be a lot easier. But the fact that it's black and white and shades of gray makes it really difficult. So a lot of times what we'll do is focus on one thing that we can seem to make the most sense out of, and we'll focus there, and everything else we'll allow to fade. Okay? And do you find yourself doing that? Do you find yourself looking at the picture, finding one thing that seems to give you, you're able to see, oh yeah, that's the loudest, that's the biggest, that's the clearest in my mind. And everything else you just kind of ignore. That's what happens. That's what we do anyway. But that's what happens with traumatic events. We need to be able to put this stuff all categorized. We have all these files. That's what we need, okay? Because we're interpreters by nature. We're constantly interpreting our life based on how we've interpreted life. So when a person experiences trauma and it remains unresolved, the brain, the body, the mind, and the emotions remember that event, and then it becomes superimposed on the interpretive matrix that they see life in the world through. Out of sight is not out of mind. Just because a person has been able to repress or suppress past trauma does not mean it is no longer embedded in the brain or the mind or the emotions and continuing to have significant impact. Okay, so what causes it, right? What causes it? Okay. As I mentioned, when the severe impact of a traumatic event goes unresolved, the brain, body, mind, and emotions continue to try to categorize and file away that hodgepodge of thoughts, reactions, and feelings that collided when the traumatic event took place. And remember, the traumatic event, we talk about this in other contexts, but trauma occurs when our ability to cope with a crisis is overwhelmed. Our coping skills, our coping mechanisms, our ability to understand and manage and handle it is overwhelmed. That creates a trauma, and the word trauma is transliterated from the Greek, and it means wound. There's a wound that takes place. But remember, we're synergistic wholes. So if it wounds one part of us, it wounds the rest of us. You cannot separate. And this is one of the things that the world doesn't really understand. And too often, people in pastoral care and biblical counseling don't understand well enough either. It's one of the reasons we have these kinds of conversations. Okay? So, understanding what constitutes trauma will be helpful to us in being better equipped to understand and provide soul care for post-trauma stress sufferers. Caring for hurting individuals and pointing them toward God's best solutions is part and parcel of the Christian life. For anyone engaged in soul care, crisis and trauma counseling is a critical aspect of ministry. Because crises arise in the life of everyone. It's not only known to us by way of human experience, it was foretold to us by God as part of His judgment oracle to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3. Now, while not all crises result in trauma, all trauma is a result of and or result in crisis. And you can end up with people in what we call trans-crisis. They go from crisis to crisis to crisis. Right? Some of you know people like that, right? It seems like they're always in crisis. That's because if they can be in crisis, they know how to deal with crisis, right? So if they can create a crisis or make something a crisis that isn't necessarily a crisis, they know how to deal with that. The way they're acting and reacting makes sense. They can justify it in their own mind and to others, or they think they can, right? It's not the case, but it becomes a fascination with crisis, okay? And then you'll have counselees who will do what we call catastrophize. They use language, this huge language, that it was horrible. I was devastated, right? Right? And you're listening to them and it says, okay, I don't understand what was so devastating about that, right? But that's how they relate to their world. Okay? That's how they feel alive and how they make sense of what's happening. So, a crisis occurs when the situation a person faces is difficult, upsetting, disturbing, distressing, or cause for fear or fearfulness, right? Crisis can be good for us. Struggle develops strength and character. Crisis causes every weak thing a person is leaning on to fail and to fall away, leaving God and His best as the only viable alternative, hopefully, right? Yet a crisis can become overwhelming to a person, and it is at this point that they often suffer trauma. Others arise, however, under exceptional circumstances. Their effect and long-term impact can be significant, even lifelong. Included in these are a variety of traumas. Trauma care experts describe 10 categories of events, the terrible 10, okay, that are particularly difficult for people to handle. Okay, I don't have these listed for you, but maybe kind of. So first is death or suicide of a family member, friend, or colleague. Death or suicide of someone close to you. Okay. The second is death at a workplace. Okay. Now in the military and emergency services, it's called a line of duty death. Then there's serious workplace or line of duty injury. Okay. The fourth is a disaster or multi-casualty incident. You know, like Kansas City, Missouri just had a tornado rip through there on Tuesday evening. I was actually on a Zoom call with somebody saying, it's right over the top of us. Well, get off of the call, right? Or multi-casualty incident, more than one person loses their life. The fifth is police shooting, accidental killing or wounding of an innocent person. So where the police are involved, or if there's an accidental killing or a wounding of an innocent person, drive-bys, things like that. Okay. The sixth is events with an extreme threat to participants. Okay. Hijacking of an airplane or a bus, if you saw speed or whatever, right? Bomb threat, that kind of stuff. Say again? Yeah. It's events with an extreme threat to the participants. So the people that are there, there's an extreme threat. They may not actually be hurt, but the threat of it, the impending danger, can be traumatic. 7 is significant events involving harm or potential harm to children. That can be even more traumatic for people than just for if it were to happen to themselves. So like a school bus crash. That's a lot more difficult for people to handle than a Greyhound bus crash. Right? Children being involved is a lot harder. 8th is prolonged experiences of suffering, especially involving a loss. Some of you have experienced long, slow death of a long loved one. That long-term suffering can be extremely difficult. Or someone who ends up in one mess after another. You get to the place where you don't know what else to do. You don't know how to think about it. You don't know how to pray about it even anymore. Especially if there's a loss on the end. You know, so you've got someone who struggled with alcohol for 20 years, and then they slip, fall, crack their head open, and now they're gone. Now there's no hope. That can be traumatic. Events in which victims are relatives. So it didn't happen to you, but it happened close to you. They were kidnapped, or their house got devastated by a tornado or burnt down or whatever. And events with excessive media interest, that was one of the things that happened after 9/11, is that the repeated showing of the planes going into the Twin Towers was traumatic for people all around the world. Okay. So any other significant event capable of causing considerable emotional distress to anyone exposed to it. There's all kinds of examples. But remember, our word trauma is transliterated from ancient Greek for trauma, which means wound or damage. Now, in medicine, trauma is damage to a biological organism caused by physical harm from an external source, right? Well, that's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about, though, on a not just a body level, but we're talking on a mental, emotional level. Major trauma is injury that can potentially lead to serious and enduring negative outcomes. So, when it comes to PTSD or CPTSD, or what we simply call PTS, we're talking about core injury because it strikes at the very core of who we are as human beings. In many cases, the moral fiber of a person is sent into shock right along with every other aspect of who they are. His friend Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, but what if he was pushed? Do you see what happens? There's a moral dilemma in the event that happened. And there's a lot of that. Someone ends their life, ends their own life. And there's all the questions. Well, what about this? What did I miss? What should I have done differently? All of that. All of that. Okay. Let me see. In soul care, what the world calls psychological trauma is a type of damage to the mind and soul that occurs as a result of an event that is severely disturbing and distressing. The problem is we usually internalize that. We usually try to manage that and deal with that on our own. Okay? Even if we pray, we will internalize and try to figure it out on our own 99% of the time, and God gets 1% of our time and attention. Okay? And people get trapped in that pattern, which is why this can continue so much, so easily. From a biblical perspective, all traumas are the result of some significant violation of God's created order that hurts or harms part of God's creation. There are times when the impact is so overwhelming that without help, order cannot be brought out of the resulting chaos. And the person is locked in to trying to create order and understanding without the tools and the skill set to carry it out. They're stuck. It's like that black and gray picture that's just this jumbled mess and they can't make any sense out of it. Okay. So, scenario that's kind of familiar to some of you. So, you got a car racing towards you as you're walking down the sidewalk. It jumps the curb and is coming straight at you. The fear you feel is authentic and is based on a real and tangible threat. You are in danger. Your fight or flight mechanisms fire up, and hopefully you get out of the way and are safe. If not, you will very likely be so seriously harmed that a hospital stay, surgeries, physical therapy, and even brain rehab might be necessary. Fast forward several months, perhaps a year after the accident. You're walking down a different street, and suddenly you hear the racing engine of a car hurtling down the street. Every fiber of your being kicks into high gear, remembering what happened the last time you heard that sound. Your memory of that event is so powerful that the then replaces now, and you have no control over how your body reacts or how your emotions surge. That gives you a picture of what a post-trauma stress sufferer deals with all the time. Now, even though this time the fast-moving car does not jump the curb, does not come speeding toward you, and puts you in no danger, you are no longer cognizant of the here and now. For all intents and purposes, you are right back in the moment when you were so severely hurt before. The problem is, that's a lie. It's not true. It's not actual. It's not real. You are trapped in a lie. You are believing that lie. You are trying to solve a problem that's not real. It's not actual. And you can't. But you're stuck in that cycle. Stuck in that cycle. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about the anatomy of PTSD, PTSD, right? The brain is incredibly complex. Recent developments in brain imaging have allowed scientists to study the brains of patients afflicted with a variety of troubles. Identifying the parts of the brain that are involved in processing those troubles is key to understanding how the troubles arise and are maintained. Brain imaging studies of post-trauma stress have identified a few key brain regions whose function appears to be altered by post-trauma stress. Most notably, the amygdala, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus. So first we have the amygdala, okay? When a traumatic event occurs, the amygdala sends out a danger signal, initiates fight or flight response, stores stimuli associated with memory, like sight, sounds, and smells, so that when you experience those again, it sends the same message. It produces calming thoughts when there's no longer any danger. Okay? That little almond-sized thing, that's pretty powerful, right? What's right above that is emotions and memory. So you see how they're tied together really close, right? When the things that happen with someone with post-trauma stress, the amygdala can keep functioning in a manner where there's no real danger. So you have a person who struggles with anxiety, hypervigilance, they're always on guard, complete avoidance of any stimuli that is associated with the trauma, exaggerated tendency to be easily startled, loud noises, sudden movements, and excessive amygdala activity. It'll be highly energized when there's nothing really going on. So the amygdala stores the sights, the sounds, and smells associated with a traumatic event, and if one or more of these stimuli are encountered, the amygdala will trigger that danger signal and engage the body all over again, just like with the car scenario we talked about. So then you have the hippocampus. Okay? The hippocampus is a large region that is involved in memory. You remember, see where the amygdala is in association with that? Oop. It's right, see where that is? It's right in front of it. The amygdala sits right in front of the hippocampus. Hippocampus is involved in memory, especially spatial memory. About places and placements, distance, those kinds of things. The hippocampus is essential to memory formation. It creates a powerful link between the memory itself and its intensity. Now, we remember best what we're most emotionally connected to. Okay? When a traumatic event occurs, the hippocampus creates and stores the memory, retrieves the memory, and calms the amygdala alarm circuit. Okay. So when the signs and symptoms of post-traumatic stress associated with the hippocampus are confusion, disorientation, recurring thoughts, nightmares or flashbacks, difficulty sleeping, and then a reduced size of the hippocampus, it actually starts to shrink. So when a person develops post-traumatic stress, the hippocampus has a central role in the re-experiencing of the traumatic events. A traumatic memory can be involuntarily retrieved when triggered by any of a number of stimuli. I mean, you're suddenly just back there. And it can happen years after the event. Now, these memories tend to be very strong, and the hippocampus becomes overactive in those with post-trauma stress. This combination makes it easy for these memories to be brought back to the forefront, both during times of wakefulness, like a flashback, or sleep, a nightmare. Impaired sleep with frequent nightmares is among the most common and frustrating symptoms reported by people with post-trauma stress. The thing is, a lot of times the nightmares don't make sense. They can't associate it with anything real or actual sometimes. It's a lot of times the night terror, that nightmare, is representative of something but not actual. Okay. The hippocampus is unable to calm down the amygdala because the danger is perceived as real. Okay. So then you have the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex lies directly behind the forehead within the frontal lobes and controls behavior, emotions, and impulses. Okay? This is where your thinking, your rationality and reason operate out of. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. Okay? Now the effects of traumatic stress on this region are irritability, withdrawal features like avoidance, numbing, those kinds of things, disengaging, lack of affect, and reduced activation of the prefrontal cortex. It just starts to shrink down and doesn't energize much. Because the other regions of the brain that are involved in survival are activated, energized, and so the prefrontal cortex starts to actually atrophy. In those with post-trauma stress, prefrontal cortex gets less and less active, so a person starts to withdraw. And because of the reduced activity, it's unable to override the hippocampus as it flashes the memory, so it can't signal to the amygdala that there's no real danger. The ventromedial, where is it? Am I going the right way? There we go. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex. It's a higher, more sophisticated part of the brain. It's involved in less well-defined activities like emotional processing and decision-making, weighing and balancing. Let me give you a very generalized model, okay? So you see a tiger, right? You get some environmental cue that signals danger, okay? This information is sent to the amygdala, which gets fired up and starts sending out fight or flight responses to other parts of the brain. You're about to become lunch, right? However, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, being involved in higher thinking, has a very quiet word with the amygdala and says, shh, it's okay. It is a tiger, but it's a tiger in a cage. You know what a cage is. Tigers can't escape cages. You're okay. Calm down. Okay? The hippocampus then helps out, providing information about the context of the event. We're at a zoo. We know what zoos look like. We've seen them before. Okay? So we can see that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex inhibits the amygdala to help keep fearful responses in check. So here's kind of a diagram to help you see how this all works. Hippocampus processes the information into memories. Okay, goes through encoding them, organizing the sensory information, and then consolidating, grouping the information into memories and storing them. And then the amygdala specializes in the processing of the emotional memories. That works with the hippocampus. Okay? But the problem is that when you're in fight or flight mode, you have all these hormone fluctuations that inhibit the processes from being balanced and normal. So brain imaging studies. You see the brain on the left is a PTSD or post-trauma stress brain. But the non-PTSD or non-PTS brain, do you see how the regions of the brain are branch out more and they're bigger and they're fuller? So the regions of the brain start to atrophy over time and they stop to function because the functioning aspect of the brain has narrowed its scope. Okay? Long-held interpretation of these studies is that in post-trauma stress, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex is asleep at the wheel, allowing the amygdala to run unchecked and produces many of the intense anxiety symptoms that are a key feature of post-trauma stress. After a traumatic event occurs, the prefrontal cortex should let the amygdala know that it's okay to calm down once the danger is dissipated. When that doesn't happen, post-trauma stress begins to set in. And over time, if the post-trauma stress cycles are not repatterned, the brain experiences significant and long-lasting damage, actually preventing it from not following the entrenched second nature reactions. And we're going to talk about these a little bit later. So when the trauma is prolonged, extreme or repetitive, it can actually physically injure the brain as we see here. Neuroimagery actually suggests that trauma and the chemical processes that go with it lead to damage, shrink the hippocampus, which is where all our memories are stored. And it's almost as if the amygdala is stuck in the position that we described above. It keeps a person's body from working properly. Neurotransmitters lose their ability to recover. Neural pathways get entrenched into a pattern that's not healthy or based on reality. Long after the original trauma ends, the person suffers from the symptoms. He or she lives and responds to a reality that's as if responds to a reality as if it were a memory fragment from long ago. Cannot separate now and safe from now and danger. Now is danger with those specific triggers. The amygdala keeps shutting them down, not be able to separate. The post-trauma stress sufferer is not able to tell if the situation they're in is safe or not. They're always afraid, and almost everything seems like a threat to them. So, who gets it? Who gets this? Well, it can occur at any age, including childhood. Women are more likely to develop than men, and there's some evidence that susceptibility to the condition may run in families. There's no real clear study on that, but there seems to be some repeated symptomology. The reason they say women are more, because women have a tendency to be more emotionally aware, more emotionally connected to life. That is what gives women the ability to remember details about, a conversation 10 years ago. Okay, that was emotionally significant, can remember where you were, what you were wearing, what the other person was wearing, what you ate for dinner, all kinds of details, because you're emotionally involved, emotionally invested. But that can also help a woman get more trapped in post-trauma stress. Okay, it can occur at any age. War veterans, survivors of physical, sexual assault, abuse, accidents, disasters, all kinds of serious events. And not everyone with post-trauma distress has been through a dangerous event. Some people get post-trauma stress after a friend or family member experiences danger or is harmed. The sudden, unexpected death of a loved one can also cause post-trauma stress. So, why do some get it and some not? It's important to remember that not everyone who lives through a dangerous event gets post-trauma stress. In fact, most people will not develop this condition. Many factors play a part in whether a person will get post-trauma stress. Some of these are risk factors that make a person more likely to get it. Other factors, called resilience factors, can help reduce the risk of the condition. Some of these risks and resilience factors are present before the trauma, and others become important during and after a traumatic event. So some of the risk factors, okay? Living through dangerous events or traumas, having a history of trauma, getting seriously hurt, seeing people seriously hurt or killed, feeling horror, helplessness, or extreme fear. What's really interesting about this is I've watched children be traumatized by horror films when they're 3, 4, 5 years old and never recover from that. It's traumatic for them, okay? Watch a little boy, 2.5, 3 years old, in a cart, at the store around Halloween. And mom grabs this toy and brings it over to the kid, and the kid is terrified and screaming, doesn't want it. Oh, mom's going, oh, but it's cute, it's cute. And she continued to, and that kid then just finally shut down and just went empty. She just traumatized that child. Not meaning to, but she did. We have to understand that when we are exposed to things that are outside God's created order, God's intent, they can and very often are traumatizing. So to say, well, that shouldn't have had that effect, why not? If we are using as entertainment something that God abhors and something that God has said, this shall not be, that's going to be traumatizing. Keep your questions.
It's not a question. Can you just say what you said, the dots again, so far, the bullet points?
I don't know which ones you're talking about.
Can you just say them again, that you've got the risk factors? Living through dangerous
Okay, living through dangerous events and traumas, having a history of trauma, getting seriously hurt, seeing people seriously hurt or killed, feeling horror, helplessness, or extreme fear, having little or no social support after the event. This is huge. If a person has no support, no one to fall back on, no one to talk to, no one to process through or debrief with these things on, and they're stuck with them themselves, it can be significant. Or if they try to talk about it and people won't hear or won't listen. We find this with abuse survivors who go forward and report the abuse and they're not believed. Okay. Resilience factors, again, debriefing soon after the event. First 24 to 48 hours are the most significant. That's best. Other resilience factors are seeking out support from other people you know and trust, know that